to Perform Book Club with myself, your semi-host, Father Fessio, Vivian Dudro from Ignatius Press, off-site, sheltering as we all are still, and Joseph Pierce, growing his beard in South Carolina, although now he's returned to Mass, so he doesn't have to do this, but his wife has decided she likes his face covered with something, so if he can't wear a mask, he's going to at least have a beard. We're going to continue this wonderful book by Nicolas Diat called A Time to Die, Monks on the Threshold of Eternal Life. And of course, we're all on the threshold of eternal life. Some are closer to it than others, like myself, although we never know. And I believe we're going to go to chapter 3. Is that correct? A Fortress Away from the World?
That's correct.
Well, this is on the Abbey of Solesmes. And our wonderful assistant here, Thomas Jacoby, is going to show us some pictures of Solesmes and where it is on the map. It's quite a famous monastery, especially today, that is to say in the last 100 years. It was destroyed in the French Revolution in the late 1700s, early 1800s. But in early 1800s, a family visited the ruins. And the child in that family, his name was Prosper Guéranger, he was 13 years old. He looked at these ruins and he said, someday I will rebuild this monastery. At age 13, he said that. And sure enough, he became a Benedictine monk. And with 4 or 5 others, he came to Solesmes, and they actually rebuilt Solesmes. And not only in that sense restored monastic life in that particular place, but also began to restore the tradition of sacred music. And so Solesmes is known today especially for the restoration of Gregorian chant. And Guéranger himself wrote several volumes on this. His successors followed in his footsteps. And today, Solesmes is still seen as sort of the world center for beautiful Gregorian chant. So that's the monastery that Nicolas Diat visited. And now I've given the color. Maybe some of you can add the substance.
Well, the first thing I have is 61. So does anybody anything earlier than 61, page 61?
No? Go ahead.
I'll kick things off in that case then. So basically this page, I'm only going to pluck out a couple of lines, but the whole bottom half of page 61 is the father talking about this priest who's old and incapacitated, takes an awful lot of care every single day. And the danger is that you go through the motions, you dehumanize things because of the routine. And so I love the line here, about 8 lines up from the bottom. The risk of commodification of the sick exists. In other words, when you're going through the motions, the sick person becomes dehumanized in your mind and he becomes a commodity. And then I love this line. It's actually really set me thinking. I need to know how to lose my time for the sick. Now, not use my time, but lose my time. As if, we should not be envious and jealous of our time. That's mine, right? We should be actually looking to lose it. And then he connects that immediately with the next sentence, or 2 sentences later. But in life, giving freely is essential. Christ said that the man who loses his life gains it. And I've never before sort of put that line from the gospel in the context of willingly wanting to lose time. I mean, all of us every day are trying to sort of time manage to make sure that we're doing all the things we should do and not letting anybody down and meeting deadlines. But this whole idea of, hang on, we should just lose time. If there's a sick person or somebody in need, we should not, everything else should be put to one side and don't worry about it. Lose your life, lose your time, you may gain it. Wonderful.
That's good. And I'm thinking as you're speaking there, Joseph, that this book, which is about how the monks approach death and sickness and so on, losing time for those who are, in the infirmary, and also resisting commodification of life and death. That really gives us kind of a clear picture of what we have to try and do in our own way outside of a monastery, because we're all subject to that same thing of commodification of death. And do you really want to die with all these tubes in you in a hospital with no one around you except wearing masks? I remember years ago, there was a Sacred Heart sister from up near USF here, University of San Francisco, and she was an old sister, very, very, brilliant. She was had been, I think, the president of the university there, and she was quite competent. But she was dying, and so in the last few stages of her life, they want to protect her from any kind of infection. So in order to go visit her, you had to put on a surgical gown and put on a mask. And so here's this woman who's dying and barely able to recognize people. And what comes in but a ghost, no, let's just talk to her. If she dies a day sooner, she's 94 years old. Yeah, but it's kind of commodification, preserving life to the last moment. Not a good idea. So the monks,
and it also turns it systemically as well. In other words, that basically the person has become subject to the system. We do things a certain way here in this hospital. We have all our rules and regulations, and the person has to fit into that. And so the whole humanity of this person's about to die anyway. Why not let them spend time with his or her loved ones and let her die in peace, rather than dying basically completely freaked out because of the surreal situation she finds herself in.
Well, it's interesting because this section right here is not talking about what happens in a hospital. It's talking about the danger to us when we're taking care of others of commodifying that person because we want to get on with our lives. And we ended up just taking care of people in a routine way to get it over, as he says, as quickly, as mechanically, and as quickly as possible. And this can happen when you're taking care of children. This can happen when you're taking care of the sick. And so the warning here that he's trying to give us has nothing to do with people in hospitals.
Okay.
It has to do with people in our lives and how this creeps in if we're not careful. And so, Joseph, I too was so struck by this line, being willing to lose my time for the sick in the same way that I'm willing to lose my life for Christ, that's how I actually gain myself. And of course, the Benedictine motto is care for the sick as if they're Christ, just as you welcome the stranger as if he's Christ. So this is the Beatitudes. So in any case, I too was deeply moved by that. And I just thought of all of the times I had to take care of someone who was sick, or even, the times when we're called out of ourselves to minister to the poor, and how you can start out with this kind of sentimental idea. You're going to do something good for the poor. And next thing you know, this poor person in front of you can become actually somebody you just want to get away from as quickly as possible.
well, you think,
Right?
you say, lose one's life. What is our life except time? I mean, that's all we got up to, right? Is the time that we're living. Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, Hopkins, again, one of my favorite phrases about mortality is from Gerard Manley Hopkins when he says in The Wreck of the Deutschland, "We are soft sift in an hourglass." Well, that really sums it up. That's what we are, soft sift in an hourglass.
Well, also, I mean, this is a little off topic, but it's one of the horrors of abortion. And the fact if someone kills me, I'm 79. I'm only losing maybe 10 years, But if someone kills a child in the womb, you're losing 80 years. I mean, the whole life, there's no first dance. There's no first going to school. There's no first baseball game, nothing. It's all gone. I mean, if I die, hey, man, I've lived. And in fact, in Rome, that's how they would say when someone died, they would say, vixit, he has lived.
Well, this
also about in the context of this as well, there's in Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare, in reference to our life and our doings, often uses the word O-W-E, and it's often actually glossed as own, O-W-N. No, when Shakespeare's talking about life, he's not saying you own your life, he's saying you owe your life. Don't upgrade Shakespeare to modern English if it's actually changing his meaning, right?
Okay.
Right. Well, the expression people, do tend to complain, oh, my time is not my own. And you want to say, that's right.
That's correct, it isn't.
All right.
Well, this line here, when we come before God, we will be accountable for our charity toward the weakest. And these are the people who are the weakest, the unborn, the sick, the child, the people who cannot care for themselves, who are utterly dependent on us. And for us to not harden our hearts, because it's a burden to take care of these people.
Well, I have something on page 71.
Onward.
Basically, towards the bottom, one thing you hear about this book makes it clear that monks are human like the rest of us. They have the same weaknesses, the same fears. But the monastic life is focused, at least. You know, our worldly lives are full of distractions. I know monks can be distracted, but they're focused. So I love this here. Our existence must be a novitiate for eternity. The entire liturgical life of a monk prepares him for the final hours. When the monks depart, I ask them not to forget us once they are in heaven. Sometimes I tell myself that our brothers are so happy near God that they neglect us a little. We are in a profound communion with our dead. We think of them every day. I mean, that really is someone that's focused on the eternal life, which, you know, because this life is only a novitiate, as they want to say, a novitiate for eternity. You know, the real life begins afterwards, or the full life begins afterwards.
Well, that word focus brings something else to mind to me, that another thing a monastery does is it focuses, it condenses your community so that, you know, we live both physically and virtually in a very wide community of people in our town, in the state, we travel and so on. And so our relationships are kind of dispersed. Whereas in a monastery, everybody's there with each other all the time. And so you have that ability to think of each other, think of your dead and remember them. So once again, I think the monastic life is for us kind of a condensate, if you will, of the life we all have to live, but it reminds us of the relations we should have with our wider, more widespread relationships.
I agree. And it also shows the difference, I think, between, losing time through distraction, which is wasting it, and losing time by giving it to others. So the people in the monastery might think, well, what are they doing with their life? Right?
Yeah.
Stuck in the same four walls all day long, doing nothing but prayers and eating, right? What are they doing there? But they're losing their time in the best sense of the word because they're staying focused on eternity. Whereas we lose our time so often just by being distracted, by wasting our time on distractions.
Yeah. Focusing on temporality or, the passing world.
Speaking of how time gets consumed, on page 75, this description of the depressive that the abbot is describing as a dissatisfied saint. I just found this description as a temperamental type I'm familiar with. This brother was a dissatisfied saint, a talented organist, a true artist, extremely sensitive. He was depressive. You had to put him in bed one way, tuck him in another way, give him his medicine in a precise order that he alone established. The days were ritualized according to his anxieties. And I thought, back to this theme of time, how we, Joseph, you mentioned managing time and how often we manage our time according to our anxieties. Not necessarily according to what our priorities in God's eyes really are. And so I had to take that as a call to sobriety, as well as the other, losing time on one hand for love and avoiding this temptation to manage my time according to my anxieties. These are two lessons I took from this chapter.
Something to me that it's become clear in this whole book is that, we tend perhaps to think of monastic life and religious life in the contemplative order as something which is, ordered and everyone is kind of really balanced and so on and et cetera. But I mean, every single difficulty and disease and problem and depression that we experience outside of monastery, we now see, they're in there too. And how do they handle it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not an escape, that's for sure. Monastic life's not an
In
escape.
fact, it may be the opposite of an escape because you're having to live with these people now for 50, 60 years, and you can't get away from them.
Yeah, you can't say bye-bye,
That's right.
That's all I have for chapter 3, Father.
Vivian?
I'm finished with
Let's
chapter
go to
3.
chapter 4, the smile of Brother Théophane in Setfonds Abbey. And we're going to get some pictures, I think, now of Setfonds Abbey, where it is, which is pretty much in the center of France. And you can see that beautiful, wow, that's glorious. This is a Trappist abbey, by the way. And of course, the Trappists is one of the many reforms of Benedictines. We just talked about Solesmes. That's the traditional Benedictine order. The Trappists were established by Derancey, and it was an attempt to restore a more austere life to some of the Benedictine monasteries, which had become a little more lax. So let's move to the Trappist Abbey. Joseph, Vivian, anything on this chapter?
Well, I have 93, so if you're before 93, then that's all yours, Vivian.
Well, on page 85, again, in this chapter, we're focusing in on a younger man, at least at first, who dies on the younger side after really a deteriorating condition. And on page 85 in the middle, we're reminded that the Father Abbot says that for him, in carrying away a monk in the prime of life, God wants to show men that he is the only Lord of life and that men are not masters of their death. And this was after, by the way, a description on page 81 where the monks really did try everything to try to keep this man going. For 8 months, they worked to try to save him, organized, hurried, attentive, hardworking bees, and an exhausting cycle. So here again, we see this tension between, no, we are supposed to earnestly take care of life. And then there's this mystery of when, in spite of our efforts, in spite of our hopes and desires, people die, sometimes even young. And to just accept this line here back on 85, God has his reasons and is not given to us to understand them. So somehow we have to keep these things all in tension with together, caring for our health and caring for the sick, and then accepting death when it does come, not trying to prevent it or prolong it beyond reason, to love the sick and care for them, not become callous toward them. There's all these things that, living a Christian life is not easy. I don't know how many times I've been told that my faith is an escape.
No.
Like I'm looking for some kind of an easy way out or something. I'm like, excuse me, living the life of a Christian is a life of constant tensions. It's a paradox all the time.
By the way, Chesterton says...
Go ahead, Chris.
Sorry,
Go ahead,
Father. Chesterton said, that Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried.
Well, and I would say it's not just the Christian life which is difficult, but the Catholic life specifically, because it's a Catholic both and. That is, we have to yearn for heaven and realize that we're made for eternity, and at the same time take care of the sick and ourselves here to give ourselves the life that God wants us to have, to serve him. As Paul says, I don't know whether it's better to be here and serve you, Lord, or to be gone and be with you. But whatever you want, I'll do. But there's a tension.
That's right. And that's the key every day, to say to the Lord, whatever you want, I'll do.
So, Joseph, you're always quoting these Englishmen, Jeremy Hopkins and Chesterton, and who was the third one you just quoted? So that's good. I'm glad you represent your former fatherland, because now you're an American citizen. But that's good. We're Catholic. We're in France now, and we're quoting English people. That's good.
Yeah, and I obviously one thing I do love about these books, not just this one, but the books that Nicolas Diat does with Cardinal Sarah is it actually is a good little bit of dipping our toe in the water of French literature, because I mean there's this long quote in the page we just looked at from Paul Verlaine, right? So I love that. But I'm actually the French. I love the French to bits, and there's a but coming. You probably gathered, because I on page 93 I want to just sort of suggest that Father Abbot, God bless him, and I'm sure he's much holier than I am, has a little bit of existentialist tendencies. So about 10 lines down on page 93, he says, without God, man is an utter absurdity. If the end stops in a hole in the ground, life is not worth the trouble. And I want to argue with that. I don't want to argue with that in the sense that from where Chesterton came from, quoting another Englishman here, Chesterton came from, before he believed in God, he was grateful for his existence. In other words, he could look at a tree and just say, this is not meaningless. This is not absurd. This is beautiful. And that, of course, then becomes a logical and theological argument and philosophical argument for the existence of God. Well, if there's meaning, if there's beauty, if I'm grateful, who should I be grateful to? It starts you asking all the right questions. But I don't think you can just say, without God, it's all absurd. It's not all absurd, which points to God.
Well, I think you can. I won't argue with you on this one, because I think Chesterton in younger years said, because we all recognize beauty, and we have some sense of awe. And even Stephen Dawkins, you read his stuff and it's awe-inspiring when he talks about the ants and the bugs and so on. But awesome as that is, grateful as you want to be, there's no one to thank. And if you start to think it through, then you say, what's the point of this beauty? What's the point of this? I mean, it's all going to nothing. It's absurd. So I'm with the Abbot here.
But Father, we're not disagreeing. What I'm saying is that the existence of beauty points to the existence of God. So the point is, you don't have to think, that the thing that worries about this is that basically, let's face it, life is absurd, but because we believe in God, it gives it meaning. I would say that life's not absurd, which points to God, who gives it meaning.
But he's saying without God, man is an absurdity.
Well, without God, man wouldn't exist.
Well, there you go.
So, I mean, what I'm worried about is the idea that man is absurd, and it's only God that stops us being absurd. Man's absurd in the sense he's a sinner, and that's ridiculous ultimately. But so in that sense, he's absurd. But he's also made in the image of God, and so I'm uncomfortable with this existentialist approach. Without God, man, it's not. You add God in. You start with absurd, you add God in to make sense of it. I think that we're not absurd, which leads to God.
Well, but that's right. But what he's saying is, without God, if you leave God out of it, man is absurd, because he's not the image of God if there's no God.
Let's take the next sentence then. If the end stops in a hole in the ground, life is not worth the trouble. So you've got Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another Englishman, in the lime tree bough of my prison, where he can't walk because he's got a bad foot. He can't go on a hike with his friends, so he's stuck under this tree all day. And he just realizes that this one lime tree, with the limited vista you can see from it, is itself a work of beauty and something to be grateful for. So, that the whole idea that life is just not worth the trouble without God, I mean, obviously it isn't, but I'm saying that life is beautiful, and that points to God, not that God's our get-out clause, because the rest of it's absurd.
Yeah. Okay. I guess that's if you're white, you have white privilege, and you live a pleasant life and have plenty to eat and drink and everything. But tell that to the cancer patient, or someone who's in a prison camp. I mean, why would Solzhenitsyn want to keep going, if there's no God?
Well, he kept going before he believed in God, and he kept going because he actually believed in goodness. And that led him to God.
Well, but if he would have then realized that goodness is simply, a bunch of atoms by chance that in certain configurations that give me pleasure at this time, that wouldn't have lasted him very long, I don't think.
No, because he had a sense of gratitude, which comes from humility.
I think we're both right, or we're both wrong, or I don't know. It's a Catholic both and here.
I think we should move on anyway. I think we should move on.
Let's let Vivian decide. No, I don't want her to decide between us. It's like it's like asking her which of her sons she prefers.
or you're throwing out the golden apple, and no matter, I'm going to start a war. So, but on a more sober note, if it's possible to get more sober than this current conversation, on page 91, when he talks about the role of palliative care and how this can be a kind of disguised euthanasia, this is a very important topic. And he starts it on page 90 by explaining that this particular brother was dying of pancreatic cancer, which from what I understand is an extremely painful and aggressive cancer. And that the hospital offered going to stronger pain relief, but that could hasten the end. We do know that morphines and things, they lower respiration and lower heart rate and so on. And as you up the dose, you can actually hasten death. Not that that's necessarily intentional, but you just have to really be careful. But then he says that on page 91, I've always had the feeling that the dying man remained conscious until the end, that there's this idea that if this is the greatest thing you're ever going to do, then you need to be awake when it happens, right? You need to be a participant in your death. We think of, I was talking last time about childbirth being similar to death. And I didn't mean to suggest that this is a passive thing. Somehow we are both surrendering and participating in something. We're taking an active role in bringing about the birth of the child. We're taking an active role in participating in our own death and accepting it. And so if you're completely unconscious because of pain medications, you are really being robbed of something. And same thing I would argue in childbirth too. If a woman's just knocked unconscious, anyway. So he goes on to say that I do not believe a man can be totally cut off from the world. I have acquired this certainty after having accompanied so many monks to death. Let's see, for the first time in my life, I'd been confronted with a situation where painkillers could precipitate death, and the line is blurred. I would say that the answer that these monks have discovered is the same answer we have to rediscover. And that is, having accompanied so many monks to death, what you see over and over in these different monasteries is that when a man is dying, he's never left alone. At every step along the way, there are people there with him, encouraging him spiritually and taking care of him physically. And so if I may jump to page 93, this metaphor of the boat, I thought was so beautiful. He says, when a monk suffers too much, he cannot pray as before. In these moments, a mysterious alchemy is created. The patient is picked up by the flow of the prayers of the other monks. The man who is going to die can no longer row the boat, but he goes forward with his brothers. Others take the oars for him. This is exactly what we're missing out on with hospital-controlled death. And the person left with being just at the mercy of these technologies and professionals and back to this commodification of the person and so on. It's this metaphor we have to rediscover. No, when one can no longer carry himself along, we go to his side and we carry him. And that's what's going to get him through the pain and the discomfort and everything else till he goes to the end. If we could only relearn from these monks how to do this, I think we would see a lot different sorts of deaths going on.
And I can tell you that just last night I was talking with the priests. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they were not allowed to go to the hospital to give the last rites.
And that's what Joseph has said too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Outrageous, absolutely outrageous. And the bishop should have been, anyway, change the subject. But one thing I would say, If we can go to page 104 quickly, if you don't feel that we've had enough time in this chapter, we can start next time. But this really does dovetail exactly with what Vivian's just said. If I just read this paragraph, it's exactly what Vivian's just said. So page 104. Naturally, the monks of Citeaux are convinced that they must accept that God can come to take them at any moment. If doctors asked to take a very old brother in critical condition to the hospital, it is highly likely they would refuse. The monks would always prefer that a religious be able to die in the abbey. Dom Olivier cited the example of Brother Felix. He did not want to go to the hospital anymore. In the ambulance that was taking him to Dijon, he considered that it was not the disease that would cause him to die, but the loads of medications he would be asked to take. He did not want additional care. He was eager to see God. The rule of the monks of Citeaux is simple. One has to die someday.
That's
it's
good.
Beautiful.
Well, let's cover this chapter 5. It's called Rainy Days because it was raining when Nicolas Diat visited there. This is about the Citeaux Abbey. I want to say a little word about that. Citeaux is the abbey from which we get the word Cistercian, which is another of the reforms of the Benedictine order. And you can see on your screen there some pictures of the landscape and of the building of Citeaux. It has an interesting history because it was founded in 1098 and by Saint Robert of Molesmes, and then it later had an English abbot, Stephen Harding, and Bernard of Clairvaux was born in 1090, so a few years before Citeaux was founded. But when he was 22 years old, he came to Citeaux. There were 7 kids in his family, 6 boys and a girl. And they left one boy home to take care of their sister Humbeline. And then the other 5 boys, Bernard and his 4 brothers, they came to offer themselves to become monks at Citeaux. But he also brought along his uncle and 26 other people he convinced to come. So Bernard of Clairvaux comes to Citeaux at age 22 with himself and 31 other people asking to enter the novitiate, which they did. A few years later, his other brother also came to join them, and his father. So this was an amazing moment in the history of the church, that this entire family with all their friends and relatives into the monastic life. And so then they were sent to Clairvaux. It was actually called Wormwood Valley. Wormwood Valley. They started a monastery there, but they renamed it Clairvaux, which means bright valley, because the sun was really shining there. And that's what led to the great, Saint Bernard, who was a major figure in the church. He preached crusades. He was a consultant to the popes and bishops. But this is the abbey, Citeaux Abbey, that Bernard came to in 1112 with 31 companions to enter. What a story that is. I will pass it on to you. Now I've given the color. Let's get the black and white.
I have nothing before 104, Vivian. What about you?
No, I too was drawn to this page, Joseph, 104. I also loved this quote on the bottom paragraph of that page. The hardest death is the little daily death when we are perfectly healthy. In life, we go from one death to another. They prepare us for the ultimate end. Little deaths of the ego are the big deaths, and they allow for a good death. And so, this challenge that's before us with how we are dying, it's requiring not only courage on the part of those who are infirm, it's requiring courage on the part of us to be willing to care for them in this way. The only reason why people are being sort of abandoned to professional hospital care is a lot of it has to do with ourselves not really wanting the burden of caring for people. If you're going to die at home, so many people say, I want to die at home. And so do I. But guess what that means? People at home taking care of you and accompanying you through death. And we need to relearn how to do that. That's something I don't think many of us really know how to do. And so we all are kind of frightened of this, not just the sick who are about to die, but those of us who have to take care of them through that. And if we could all relearn this as a church, I think we'll be better for it.
I think actually, great minds think alike, Vivian, because I also highlighted that same passage. And I actually like that one sentence. Again, things that make you think in a fresh way for the first time. I've been around, not quite as old as Father Fezio, but I'm working on it. Little deaths of the ego are the big deaths, and they allow for a good death. In other words, that when we die to ourselves every day, they are the big deaths that matter. It's like the first shall be last and the last shall be first, right? Lose our life in order to gain it. The small is the big is the small. Every time that we consciously sacrifice ourselves for another person, those little deaths of the ego are the big deaths. And it's those big deaths, those moments of sacrifice where we triumph over evil by accepting love and the giving of it, that allow us for a good death. It prepares us for the one at the end.
Yes. Well, maybe we should stop there, huh? I think we've gone about 30 minutes or so.
All right.
Yeah, I'm happy to move on there. Should we mention the book, Father?
Let's do that. The upcoming book.
So basically we have one more week at a time to die. So that's next week. But we thought we'd give everybody 2 weeks to prepare by getting the next book. And if I hold it up, here it is. It's America on Trial, a defense of the founding. And obviously with the sort of things going on at the moment, without going into that at the moment, this is obviously a very timely book for us to be considering and reading and discussing. So get a copy of this. It's published, you won't be surprised to know, by Ignatius Press. So you go ignatius.com, America on Trial, and get your copy.
Well, let's say a word about that. You briefly alluded to it, Joseph, but right now in the United States, as we're making these book club sessions, there's a great debate going on about whether our founding was a total mistake, founded in slavery, or whether it was something which was valuable and noble, and whether our present circumstances of moral degradation are a result of a flaw in the founding, or whether they're a result of a departure from the founding principles. And Bob Riley in this book covers that question. He does it in a masterful way. He starts with the very beginnings of political philosophy in Greece through the Middle Ages, and then talks about the present situation. I mean, this is the book which I think ought to be a standard textbook in political philosophy and history of the country everywhere, high schools and college, but certainly at this present time. And at this moment, we're facing an election coming up. I think is a very, very contemporary topical book, which we really ought to read carefully. Good. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we will see you next week on the Formed Book Club. God bless you all.